The wind felt unusually cold that morning, even though it was supposed to be a warm day. I remember standing near my father's grave, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold the folded program in my hand. Everything around me felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart instead of my own. Jason stood beside me, but he wasn't really with me. He kept his distance, arms folded, eyes fixed on the ground like he wanted to disappear from the whole situation. I kept hoping he would say something, hold my hand, or at least tell his family to stop. But he didn't. His mother, Linda Miller, didn't even try to hide her opinions. She leaned toward Robert and spoke in a low voice, but not low enough. I heard every word. She said I was making the whole funeral about myself, and acting like the world had ended just because I lost my father. Robert gave a small laugh and replied that people always become emotional when they think there is something to gain from a will. Those words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my chest tighten, but I refused to cry louder. I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. I looked down at the fresh soil covering my father's grave and reminded myself to stay still, to survive the moment, even if it felt unbearable. I kept thinking about my father. He was the only person who ever made me feel safe, the only one who never judged me. Losing him felt like losing my last protection in this world. And now, standing there, I felt completely alone. Linda's voice continued behind me, sharp and careless. She questioned why everything had to be so dramatic, as if burying a parent was just another routine task. Jason still said nothing. That silence hurt more than their insults. At one point, I even heard Linda say that I would probably try to secure my future through whatever my father left behind. I wanted to turn around and defend myself, but my body wouldn't move. It felt like my strength had been buried with my father. When the ceremony ended, people slowly started leaving. The cemetery grew quieter, but the heaviness in my chest only grew stronger. I stood there a little longer than everyone else, staring at the grave, hoping for some kind of peace that didn't come. Before leaving, I noticed a man in a dark suit standing near the edge of the crowd. He was watching everything closely, holding a folder. I didn't know who he was at the time, but something about him felt important. Like this moment wasn't truly over yet. I turned away, thinking the worst part of the day was already behind me. I was wrong. The drive back from the cemetery felt longer than it should have. No one spoke in the car. The silence was heavy, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel alone even when people are sitting right next to you. Jason stared out of the window the entire time. I kept waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. Not a single word about what his mother had said. Not a single attempt to check if I was okay. It felt like I was sitting beside a stranger instead of my husband. When we arrived back at the house, Linda was the first to step out. She immediately started talking again, as if the funeral hadn't just ended. Her voice was sharp, full of judgment. She commented on how I had carried myself during the service, saying it looked too emotional and unorganized. She acted like there were rules for grief, and I had broken them. Robert stood near the entrance, arms crossed, looking annoyed more than anything. He brought up something I hadn't even fully processed yet, the presence of my father's lawyer. He questioned why David Brooks had been at the cemetery and why everything seemed so formal for a simple family goodbye. The way he said it made it sound like something suspicious was happening. I tried to explain that my father had made his arrangements in advance, but Linda interrupted me almost immediately. She said people who overplan usually have hidden intentions. It felt like no matter what I said, they were already decided on their own version of the story. Jason finally spoke, but it wasn't what I hoped for. He told everyone to calm down, but he didn't defend me. He didn't tell his mother to stop. He didn't correct Robert. He just stood there, trying to avoid conflict, even if it meant leaving me exposed in front of everyone. That was the moment something inside me started to feel different. Not anger exactly, but a quiet realization that I was standing alone in a place that was supposed to feel like family. Later, I went into the kitchen to get some water. Linda's voice followed me from the hallway, still talking about how emotions can cloud judgment when money is involved. I froze for a moment, hearing her words clearly. It felt like she was waiting for something from my father's death, even before anything had been announced. I remembered how my father had been very specific about everything before he passed. He told me not to share details of his arrangements with anyone. He insisted that everything would become clear at the right time. At the time, I didn't understand why he was so strict about it. Now, it started to feel like he knew exactly what kind of people would surround me. David Brooks was still around. I saw him speaking quietly with one of the staff near the living room. He wasn't acting like a normal guest. He kept observing, writing something down, and checking his phone. Something about it made me uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. The grief was still fresh, but now it was mixed with something else. A feeling that this wasn't just the end of a funeral. It felt like the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. The days after the funeral passed in a strange, heavy quiet. The house no longer felt like a place where I belonged. Jason moved through the rooms without saying much, and I mostly kept to myself, trying to process everything that had happened. Every time I thought things would calm down, another reminder of my father's absence hit me again. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, I heard a calm, professional voice introduce himself as David Brooks. My heart tightened the moment I recognized the name. He told me that the reading of my father's will had been scheduled and that I was required to be present immediately. I stood still for a moment after the call ended. It felt sudden, even though I knew this moment would eventually come. My father had always been organized, careful about details most people ignore. Still, I wasn't ready for how quickly everything was moving. When I told Jason, he simply nodded and said he would come with me. There was no emotion in his voice, just a sense of obligation. His family, however, reacted very differently. Linda immediately insisted on joining. She said things like family matters should never be handled in private, especially when assets and inheritance were involved. Robert agreed with her without hesitation. On the way there, Linda couldn't hide her opinions. She leaned toward Robert and said she doubted there would be anything meaningful left for me. She said it in a tone that wasn't even careful, like she wanted me to hear it. Robert responded with a quiet laugh, adding that sometimes people build expectations on situations that don't match reality. I stayed silent the entire ride. Their words didn't surprise me anymore, but they still hurt in a dull, constant way. I looked out of the window and tried to focus on something else, but my mind kept going back to my father. I remembered the last time I saw him clearly awake. His voice had been weak but steady. He told me that people reveal their real selves when they believe there is nothing left to lose or gain. At the time, I thought he was just giving me advice about life. Now, it felt like something more specific, like he was preparing me for this exact moment. When we arrived at the law office, the atmosphere felt different from any normal meeting. The building was quiet, almost too controlled. David Brooks was already there waiting for us, standing near a closed door with a folder in his hand. He greeted everyone politely, but his eyes briefly met mine with a look I couldn't quite read. There was no rush in his behavior, no nervousness. It felt like he was holding something back, something important that no one else in the room understood yet. Linda walked in confidently, still acting like the situation was already decided. Jason followed behind her, silent as always. Robert stayed close, watching everything carefully. I sat down, trying to steady myself, not knowing that the next hour would change everything I thought I understood about my father's final wishes. The room felt smaller once everyone settled into their seats. It wasn't crowded, but the silence made it feel tight, like the air itself had pressure. I could hear the faint sound of papers being adjusted, chairs shifting slightly, and the steady ticking of a wall clock that seemed louder than it should have been. David Brooks sat at the head of the table, placing a thick folder in front of him. He didn't rush or show any emotion. He carefully untied the sealed string around the documents, taking his time as if every second mattered. That calmness made everything feel more serious. Jason sat beside me, but he kept a clear distance even though we were close enough to touch. He still wasn't looking at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him, as if avoiding me would somehow make the situation easier for him. I could feel the emotional distance between us more strongly than ever. Across from us, Linda had already made herself comfortable. She leaned back slightly in her chair with a confident expression, almost satisfied before anything had even been said. Robert sat next to her, leaning forward with interest, like he was waiting for something he already expected to go in his favor. I kept my hands folded in my lap, trying to stay steady. My heart was beating faster than normal, but I didn't let it show. The memory of my father's calm voice stayed in my mind, but it didn't stop the nervous feeling building inside me. David finally broke the silence. His voice was calm and controlled, like he had read these kinds of documents many times before. He began by confirming the legal details, mentioning my father's name, his estate, and the official process that had to be followed. Then he paused. That pause felt longer than it should have. It made everyone in the room shift slightly in their seats. Even Linda's expression changed a little, though she tried to hide it. David looked up from the papers for a moment before speaking again. His tone didn't change, but the words he said did. Before reading any distribution, he explained, there were specific conditions attached to the will that needed to be addressed first. The way he said it was firm, almost final. There was no suggestion that these conditions were optional or minor. They were part of the legal process itself. I noticed Jason finally glance at me for a second, but his expression wasn't clear enough for me to understand. Linda's confident look didn't disappear completely, but it started to look forced. Robert leaned back slightly, no longer as eager as before. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but something had clearly changed. Whatever everyone expected from this meeting, it was no longer certain. David Brooks placed his hands on the folder again, preparing to continue, and I realized this was only the beginning of something none of us were ready for. David Brooks turned the page and began reading the next section, his voice steady and unchanged. But the words coming out of his mouth were nothing like anyone in the room had expected. The atmosphere shifted immediately, like the temperature dropped without warning. He explained that my father had not only divided his estate, but had also attached strict behavioral conditions to it. These conditions were legally binding and had to be considered before any distribution could even begin. The more he spoke, the heavier the room felt. According to the document, eligibility was not just about family relation or legal entitlement. It depended on conduct, respect, and behavior shown during key moments after his passing. Any act of disrespect, emotional manipulation, or interference during funeral arrangements or related family proceedings would be recorded and reviewed. I felt Jason shift beside me. It wasn't a big movement, but I noticed it instantly. His posture straightened slightly, and his hands tightened together. For the first time since we arrived, he looked uncomfortable rather than distant. Across the table, Linda's expression changed slowly. The confident look she had been holding started to fade. Her lips pressed together tightly, and she stopped leaning back in her chair. Robert's face also changed as he listened more carefully, his earlier interest replaced with confusion. David continued without slowing down. He didn't react to anyone's expressions or interruptions. He read each line clearly, as if every word had already been reviewed many times before. Robert finally muttered under his breath that the conditions didn't make sense, calling them extreme. But David didn't respond to the comment. He simply kept reading, reminding everyone through his silence that this was not a discussion, but a legal instruction. The document made it clear that behavior during emotionally sensitive moments would matter just as much as financial decisions. Every action, every statement, and even patterns of disrespect could influence how the estate would be handled. I sat very still, listening carefully, trying to process what I was hearing. It felt unreal that my father had thought this far ahead, planning not just what would be given, but how people would behave when they thought there would be no consequences. Jason didn't look at me again, but I could feel the tension in him now. It was no longer quiet avoidance. It was something heavier, like realization slowly setting in. Linda tried to regain her composure, but it wasn't working anymore. The confidence she had entered with was slipping away, replaced by something she couldn't control. Robert leaned back and rubbed his hand across his forehead, clearly unsettled. David turned another page and continued reading, his voice still calm, but the meaning behind every line becoming harder to ignore. Whatever they had expected from this meeting, it was no longer what they were going to hear. David Brooks paused again, letting the silence settle before continuing. This time, the room felt completely still. Even the small sounds that were there before seemed to disappear. It was as if everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. He turned to the next section of the document and began reading the distribution details. His tone stayed calm, but the meaning of what he said began to change everything in the room. As he spoke, it became clear that a large part of my father's estate was not being divided in the way anyone expected. Instead of going through Jason's family line or being shared in the usual way, a significant portion was assigned directly to me. At first, it almost didn't register in my mind. I had to listen carefully to understand what he was actually saying. But when the words became clear, I felt my entire focus shift. David continued, explaining that the assets placed under my name were not temporary or conditional in a simple way. They were fully controlled under legal protection that prevented any outside interference. That included family members, financial advisors, and even my husband. Jason finally reacted. He turned his head toward me slowly, like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. His expression wasn't just surprise, it was confusion mixed with shock. For the first time, he looked directly at me instead of avoiding me. Across the table, Linda went completely still. The confident energy she had earlier was gone. Her face lost color, and she blinked several times like she was trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Robert's reaction was different. His jaw tightened, and the calm attitude he had earlier turned into visible anger. David didn't stop to explain or soften anything. He simply continued reading the legal terms that confirmed everything. The protection placed around the inheritance was strong and structured. It ensured that no one could challenge or override the decision easily. I sat there trying to process it all. It didn't feel real. My father had always been careful, but I never imagined something like this. He hadn't just left instructions. He had built a system that placed control in a specific direction for reasons I was only beginning to understand. Jason's eyes stayed on me for a few seconds longer, as if he was searching for an answer I didn't have. But I couldn't speak. I didn't even know how to react. Linda finally broke her silence, but her voice didn't sound as strong as before. It carried disbelief, almost frustration, as if she couldn't accept what was being said. Robert leaned forward again, but not with interest this time. It was tension, sharper and more direct. He looked like he wanted to challenge what he was hearing, but there was nothing to argue against. David closed that section of the document carefully, signaling that there was still more to come. The air in the room had completely changed, and everyone now understood that the situation was far beyond what any of them had expected when they walked in. David Brooks turned the page again, and this time his expression changed slightly. It was still controlled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that wasn't there before. The room had already been tense, but now it felt like something final was coming. He began reading the last part of the document. His voice stayed steady, but every word carried more weight than before. The clause he was about to read was the final explanation behind everything my father had arranged. He stated that my father had not only prepared financial instructions, but had also kept detailed written records of key events and behavior observed during important moments. These records were part of how decisions in the will were made. As he continued, I felt my stomach tighten. He was referring directly to actions that had taken place at the funeral. Every comment, every dismissive remark, and every moment of silence when support was expected had been documented. Jason shifted in his seat again, but this time it was different. He wasn't just uncomfortable. He looked tense, like he already understood where this was going. His eyes briefly dropped to the table, avoiding everyone. David continued reading without stopping. The document made it clear that behavior during those moments was not ignored or overlooked. It had been carefully noted and included as part of the final evaluation of character. Linda's hands tightened together. Her face had gone pale, and she no longer looked confident at all. Robert's expression was sharp now, but not in a proud way. It was frustration mixed with disbelief, like he was trying to find a way to reject what was being said but couldn't. The words in the document explained that respect, or lack of it, during emotionally significant events carried meaning. My father had treated those actions as a reflection of true character, not temporary behavior. As David read further, it became clear that these records directly influenced decisions about inclusion in the estate. The more disrespect or emotional distance shown, the more it affected eligibility in ways no one had expected. I sat still, listening, feeling a strange mix of shock and understanding. My father had seen everything, even when I thought no one was paying attention. He hadn't reacted in the moment, but he had recorded what mattered. Jason finally spoke under his breath, but it wasn't directed at anyone. It sounded more like disbelief, like he was trying to process how even silence could now be part of something so final. Linda opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, she didn't have control over the situation. Robert leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. David reached the end of the clause and closed the folder slightly, signaling that what had just been read was not open to interpretation. It was already decided. The room stayed quiet after that, but the meaning of everything had already settled in. Nothing about this meeting felt the same anymore. The silence in the room continued for a few seconds after everything had been read. No one seemed ready to move or speak right away. It felt like everyone was still trying to understand the full weight of what had just been said. I slowly stood up when the meeting was officially over. My hands were steady, which surprised me. A few days ago, I would have felt overwhelmed in a situation like this. But now something felt different inside me. It wasn't excitement or anger. It was clarity. Jason followed me out of the room. Once we were in the hallway, away from the others, he finally tried to speak. His voice was quieter than before, almost careful. He said my name softly, like he was trying to reach me in a way he hadn't bothered to do earlier. He started explaining himself, saying things that sounded like regret. He mentioned pressure, family expectations, and how he should have reacted differently. But while he spoke, I noticed something strange. His words didn't affect me the way they would have before. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how far apart we had become. It wasn't just about that day or the meeting. It was about everything leading up to it. The distance between us had been growing for a long time, and I had ignored it because I didn't want to face it. He reached out slightly, as if expecting me to respond the way I used to. But I didn't. I just stood there, listening without reacting. That silence between us felt heavier than any argument. In that moment, I thought about my father. I remembered how he always paid attention to people's behavior, even when they thought no one was watching. He didn't judge quickly. He observed, waited, and understood patterns over time. Now I realized what he had actually done. He hadn't just prepared financial arrangements. He had created something that reflected trust, respect, and consequences based on actions. It wasn't only about property or inheritance. It was about recognizing who truly stood by me when things were hardest. For the first time, I saw my situation differently. I wasn't dependent in the way I had felt before. There was structure in place that didn't leave me exposed or uncertain. I had support that didn't rely on approval from people who had already shown where they stood. Jason kept talking for a moment longer, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My attention was no longer tied to trying to fix something that had already shifted. I realized that my father hadn't just left behind legal instructions. He had left me something stronger. Stability that didn't depend on others' opinions, and a clear understanding of where I stood now. And in that realization, something inside me settled. Not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that room earlier. The days after everything was finalized felt very different. Life did not suddenly become loud or dramatic, but there was a clear shift in how people acted around me. Things that used to feel confusing or unstable now had structure and direction. Jason became distant in a new way. It was no longer just emotional silence. It was pressure from things he could not easily fix or ignore. I noticed he spent more time on calls and less time at home. When he was home, he avoided long conversations and kept his answers short. His family reacted even more strongly. Linda's confidence was gone, replaced with frustration that she tried to hide in public, but not always in private. She would start speaking as if trying to defend herself, then stop halfway through, as if realizing it didn't change anything. Robert stopped making comments altogether in front of me. When we crossed paths, he would look away quickly, like he didn't want any interaction at all. The same people who once spoke freely around me now acted careful, like every word carried weight. There were also changes happening behind the scenes. I could tell from small things. Phone calls that ended quickly when I entered the room, conversations that suddenly stopped, and expressions that changed when my name came up. It felt like everyone was adjusting to a situation they had not expected. At the same time, I started noticing that I was being left out of discussions that used to include me indirectly. Not because I was excluded openly, but because people assumed things had changed and avoided bringing certain topics up around me. Jason and I barely spoke about anything meaningful anymore. When we did, it usually ended in silence or short answers. There was no confrontation, but there was also no connection left between us the way there used to be. One evening, I overheard part of a conversation between Linda and Jason. Her voice sounded tense, trying to explain things that no longer seemed to have simple answers. Jason didn't respond much. It was clear he was struggling with something he could not fully express. What surprised me most was how quickly roles had shifted. The same people who once acted confident and in control were now careful and uncertain. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was consistent enough that I could see the difference in every interaction. I also started focusing more on my own space. I spent time organizing my thoughts and understanding what my future would look like without constantly reacting to others. The environment around me had changed, and I was slowly adjusting to that reality. There was no dramatic confrontation that explained everything. Instead, it was a steady shift where actions and behavior naturally led to consequences that could not be ignored. And with each passing week, it became clearer that things could not simply go back to how they were before. In the end, everything became quieter than I ever expected. There were no big arguments, no loud final fights, and no dramatic ending scene like people might imagine. Instead, it all settled into a simple, clear understanding of what had really happened over time. I spent a lot of time alone after things fully changed. Not because I was forced to, but because I needed space to think clearly without noise or pressure from others. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to anyone else's emotions or opinions. I was just observing everything from a distance. Jason and I no longer functioned the way a married couple should. Conversations became rare and short. Even when we were in the same space, it felt like we were separated by something invisible, but very real. There was no anger left between us, just emptiness and acceptance of what had already shifted. His family also stopped behaving the way they used to. The confidence they once carried slowly disappeared, replaced with hesitation in how they spoke and acted. They no longer treated situations as if they were in control. Instead, they seemed careful, always aware that things had changed permanently. What struck me most was how everything unfolded without me needing to argue or fight for it. I didn't have to prove anything or create conflict. The truth simply became visible through time and actions. People revealed who they were in moments they thought had no consequences, and that was enough. I started to understand my father's intentions more clearly. He hadn't just left behind instructions or property. He had created a situation where character would naturally show itself under pressure. Nothing was forced. Everything unfolded based on how people behaved when they believed outcomes were already decided. There was a strange kind of peace in realizing that I wasn't responsible for how everything ended up. I didn't have to chase fairness or force outcomes. The structure he left behind handled things in its own way, through clarity rather than confrontation. I thought about all the moments that had led to this point. The silence, the words spoken in frustration, and the choices people made when they thought no one was carefully watching. All of it had built toward a result that no one could easily reverse. As I moved forward in life, I no longer carried the same weight I once did. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled how I saw myself or my future. I understood now that strength doesn't always come from fighting back. Sometimes it comes from standing still while truth reveals itself. And in that understanding, I finally saw the full meaning of everything that had happened. It was not about revenge in the way people usually think. It was about consequences unfolding naturally, without noise, exactly when they were meant to.